This is part 2 of my recording on the essay Whither Gold, originally published in 1996 by Antal Fekete. Whose standard? It is the task of the government and the legal system of the country, in order to preserve civil conduct in the marketplace, to define the standard of weights and measures, and to define the standard of value by issuing coinage, and in case of non-performance on contracts or in case of fraud, to compel the delinquent party to live up to his side of the bargain through the use of the government apparatus of coercion. However, this ideal has often been corrupted by governments misusing their prerogative in defining the standard of weights and measures capriciously in order to favor a minority at the expense of the majority. This type of government intervention in the voluntary exchanges of market participants is no longer practiced. Public opinion would not tolerate the arbitrary shortening of the standard unit of length through the device of crowning an infant king and declaring the length of his foot the new standard. Just how much this improvement in government policy is due to enlightenment and proper sense of justice, and how much to the changing parameters of public ignorance, can be decided only after considering the fact that it is still not below the dignity of governments to tamper with the standard of value capriciously in order to favor a minority at the expense of the majority. Governments have found that the level of general ignorance concerning the nature of value is such that public opinion can suffer the affront of manipulating the standard of value. Out of sheer ignorance, people meekly accept the consequences of this policy of victimization. In fact, governments of the 20th century have carried the practice to its ultimate. They have accomplished what no government in the long history of civilization has been able to do. Hard as they may have tried, governments can now tamper with the standard of value on a monthly, weekly, daily, or hourly basis with impunity through the instrument of irredeemable currency and through open market operations in the foreign exchange and bond markets. Governments not only get away with this dangerous prestidigitation, they are lionized for performing it. Part of the explanation for the anomaly of our ignorance amidst informational bounty is the subtle control governments have over education, but that is another story. Before the tampering with the standard of value was developed into the high art of deception it is today, governments wishing to alter the terms of trade in favor of a minority at the expense of the majority could only do so at their own peril. They always had the prerogative to coin money. But in attending to this task, governments did not create money, still less wealth. An economic good becomes money only by virtue of the public's preference in making its marginal utility constant. Governments don't select the monetary metal. That is the market's prerogative. The government stamp placed upon a piece of metal does not create value. All it does is to certify the weight and fineness of the coin. The purpose of stamping it is to obviate weighting and the application of the acid test to each gold piece at every exchange. It is to facilitate the circulation of coins by tale rather than by weight. Whenever governments have resorted to debasing the standard of value by issuing coins of a baser alloy but with the same stamp, the same name, and the same outward appearance of coins, they knew full well that they were engaging in a fraudulent attempt to cheat the public. To the extent that it took time to expose the fraud, governments have been making an illegitimate profit, and they have been enriching a favored minority, the export merchants, at the expense of the unsuspecting majority, the domestic consumers. But after the fraud is exposed, as sooner or later it must be, the debased coins go to a discount representing the extent of debasement. Governments have insisted that it is not the alloy but the stamp that has made the coins valuable. They have declared it illegal to discriminate against light coins in favor of the heavy ones. They have declared maximum prices. Violation of the law of maximum has sometimes been made punishable by death. But as the government's writ stops at the border, and people on the other side are free to separate the light from the heavy coins as they see fit, the coin debasers are forced to admit that their policy is a failure. However, tampering with the standard of value continues. Techniques do change. The intent to benefit a favored minority at the expense of the unsuspecting majority does not. Bimetallism, stratagem to benefit a minority at the expense of the majority. As two precious metals, silver and gold, were used side by side as money, governments declared a statutory bimetallic ratio at which the monetary metals were to be valued at the mint. We may bypass the question whether it was ignorance or deviousness which motivated governments to enforce a rigid bimetallic ratio, in pretending the value could be created or altered by legislation. Be that as it may, bimetallism was dear to the heart of governments as it offered an opportunity to tamper with the standard of value on a regular basis. This is how it worked. The public would deliver the overvalued metal to the mint, making this metal the de facto monetary standard, while using the undervalued metal for payments abroad where it commanded a higher value. In this way, one monetary metal always appeared to be abundant, while the other appeared to be scarce before disappearing altogether. It was the inconvenience to trade caused by the abundance cum scarcity of bimetallic coinage that gave occasion to repeated tampering with the standard. To grant relief, governments would alter the bimetallic ratio in favor of the scarce metal. This would cause the abundant coins to become scarce and the scarce coins to become abundant. The wrong shoe was now on the other foot, and the game of changing the bimetallic ratio could start all over again. It should be clear that whenever a change in the standard unit of value is proposed, some people stand to gain, namely those net long in the metal to be overvalued or net short in the metal to be undervalued by the impending change, while others stand to lose, namely those net long in the metal to be undervalued or net short in the metal to be overvalued. Since the general public is always long in the metal to be overvalued, it is always on the losing side. A minority of insiders with advanced knowledge of the timing and extent of the devaluation stands to gain from it at the expense of the general public. Yet the game of dropping one shoe after the other, only to repeat the trick afterwards, was wearing one shoe thin faster than the other. The alternating standard resulted in a progressive depreciation of silver in terms of gold. In antiquity, the gold-silver ratio was about 10. 500 years ago, at the time of the discovery of America by Columbus, the ratio was still only 11. The decline in the value of silver continued during the next 300 years. On April 2, 1792, the U.S. dollar was defined as 371.25 grains of fine silver or 24.75 grains of fine gold. This was bimetallism at the ratio of 15 at a time the market ratio was closer to 15, thus overvaluing silver and putting the dollar on a de facto silver standard. On June 28, 1834, the U.S. Congress increased the official bimetallic ratio from 15 to 16. The new ratio was higher than the market ratio, overvaluing gold and putting the dollar on a de facto gold standard. By 1870, the accelerating decline in the value of silver threatened the U.S. mints with a deluge of the silky metal. To meet this threat, Congress, in the Coinage Act of 1873, dropped the standard silver dollar from the list of coins that could be minted freely on private account. Thereafter, silver was to be coined at the pleasure of the government. This would have put the dollar on a de jure gold standard, had the U.S. mints been open to gold. But they were not. In 1873, the U.S. government still maintained a regime of irredeemable paper currency, the greenbacks, a legacy of the Civil War. This fact explains why the 1873 demonetization of silver went unnoticed by the general public, including the powerful silver lobby. The fall in the value of silver continued to accelerate as the gold-silver ratio rose from 16 to 19 by Resumption Day in January 1879, when the U.S. government reopened the mint to gold and resumed gold convertibility of the greenback. Thereafter, the value of silver was falling precipitously, the gold-silver ratio almost reaching 40 by the turn of the century. The silver lobby woke up and started crying bloody murder, bitterly denouncing the crime of 1873. During the 1896 presidential election campaign, the Democratic candidate William Jennings Bryan, in his famous Cross of Gold speech on the stump, pledged to return the country to a bimetallic monetary standard. He failed to understand, as did most other observers, that demonetization was the effect rather than the cause of the collapse in silver's value. With the demise of bimetallism in the 1870s, the ability of government to benefit a minority at the expense of the majority was greatly curtailed, albeit not for long. Hijacking gold on its way from the mines to the mints by the central banks opened up new possibilities for credit manipulation, making it easy for governments to defraud the unsuspecting majority in favor of a minority. In our days, the deception that governments can create value and wealth out of thin air through a judicious monetization of their own credit is an article of faith at virtually all chanceries and universities. The opposing view, represented by this essay, that credit manipulation cannot create but can indeed destroy capital, and so it cannot lead to prosperity but ultimately pauperize the entire society through credit collapse, as it did during the Great Depression, appears to be but a lonely cry in the wilderness. A short course on demonetization. Quantity theorists widely predicted that the demonetization of gold would seriously undermine gold's exchange value. A representative of this view is the first quotation from Mises on page 3 above. They argue that the removal of the lion's share of the demand could not help but make gold cheaper. As a reinforcement of this argument, quantity theorists were fond of recalling the episode of silver demonetization in the last century. They claimed that the demonetization had caused a prolonged decline in the price of silver that has been continuing ever since. It is not known whether these views had any influence on the thinking of the decision-makers who demonetized gold in 1971. Be that as it may, the idea that dishonoring promises to pay gold would somehow cause the dishonored paper to go to a premium in gold is preposterous. It is true that insolvent bankers have in the past often tried to promote their discredited paper, sometimes using such extreme measures as the threat of the death penalty, as did John Law of Lauriston in France. To no avail. Logic and history prove that dishonored promises to pay always and everywhere go to a discount, never to a premium. Indeed, this is exactly what happened after gold was demonetized worldwide in 1971. In less than a decade, the US dollar went to a 90% discount in terms of gold. The discount is fully commensurate with the 90% loss in purchasing power that the dollar has suffered during the same period. Even though the discount on the dollar fluctuates, the hope that it would ever disappear is a forlorn one. The disarray in the nation's budgetary and trade accounts suggests that currency depreciation is likely to continue, if not to accelerate. The only way to stop the rot would be to adopt a credible plan to resume gold redeemability of the dollar, but no party has so far mustered the political courage to propose it. The comparison between the demonetization of silver in 1873 and the so-called demonetization of gold a century later is disingenuous. In fact, the use of the word demonetization in connection with the latter is quite inappropriate. It is but a euphemism for debt abatement or partial debt repudiation inflicted upon the foreign creditors of the United States of America. In 1971, these creditors were deprived of a valuable property right to a fixed amount of gold, or to the dollar equivalent thereof. The unilateral and capricious act has done nothing to benefit the citizens or the governments of the U.S. On the contrary, the debt abatement had one predictable consequence: harsher terms on future borrowings, as measured by the higher and unpredictable rate of interest at which the government and the people of the U.S. can borrow at home and abroad. It is true that the burden of the debtors who had contracted debt prior to the abatement was lightened. But insofar as they were the same people and the same government on whom the burden of the harsher terms on further borrowings fell for the indefinite future, there were no beneficiaries, only losers. In particular, the big loser was the American taxpayer. The international credit of the United States government, which had been the envy of the world for over a century, was grievously damaged, as manifested by the unprecedented interest rates the Treasury was forced to pay upon its obligations after the debt abatement. The stubborn insistence the credit of the U.S. has not been damaged in the demonetization exercise of 1971 is the centerpiece of mainstream economic orthodoxy. Yet this is a world of crime and punishment, and no one, not even the government of the mightiest nation on earth, can exempt itself from the consequences, which are numerous. America's industry has lost its international competitiveness. Due to the high rates of interest, a large segment of America's park of capital goods has become submarginal, as producers were either unwilling or unable to maintain it or to replace it by more up-to-date equipment. As capital became submarginal, so did the producers using it. They were forced to sell their businesses at a loss and to invest the remnants of their former wealth in high-yield treasury bonds. This is a textbook case showing that a government can only harm itself by harming its own taxpayers. Printing high coupon rates on its bonds, the U.S. government turned former producers of wealth into coupon clippers. The world is witnessing the progressive deindustrialization of America, as a large segment of the producers find themselves unable to compete with those capricious coupon rates the government high-handedly prints on its bonds. At the same time, the main competitors of American industry in Japan and Germany are the beneficiaries of a low interest rate structure made possible by those countries' more stable currencies. While the so-called demonetization of gold was a farce staged by the U.S. government in order to cover up its own insolvency, the demonetization of silver 100 years earlier was a genuine market phenomenon. Government action in demonetizing silver amounted to little more than a belated acknowledgement of a fait accompli. There was no dishonoring of promises to pay. There was no deterioration in the public credit, no destruction of private capital. On the contrary, by virtue of its cooperating with market forces, the government greatly enhanced its credit. The United States was well on its way to become the world's greatest creditor nation. 100 years later, the government, in demonetizing gold, was moving against market forces, and the credit of the U.S. government suffered its greatest setback in the history of the nation. The deterioration of the credit of the United States still continues, with unforeseeable consequences. This is not generally acknowledged by financial writers at home and abroad, but one palpable and indisputable consequence of the demonetization of gold was that, in a few short years, the U.S. had turned itself from the world's greatest creditor into the world's greatest debtor nation. The United States was forced to borrow enormous sums abroad at exorbitant rates of interest. The gross mismanagement of credit has created enormous problems for which there are no painless solutions. The dual nature of money. The evolution of a dual monetary standard involving both silver and gold was no accident. In every treatise on money, in one form or another, the proposition is advanced that money, whatever else it may be, is a transmitter of value through space and time. Thus the concept of money is directly linked to these two absolute categories of human thought. The space-time dichotomy explains the dualistic nature of money, explicitly observable throughout the ages, right up to the demise of bimetallism. In its first capacity, money must be able to transfer value through space, over great distances, with the smallest possible loss. In antiquity, cattle were used especially suitable for this purpose and became money. In its second capacity, money must be able to transfer value through time with the smallest possible loss. Cattle money was scarcely suitable for this second task. This explains the emergence of another kind of money, suitable for hoarding and dishoarding with the greatest ease, in order to facilitate the transfer of value over time. Originally, this other kind of money was salt. And not only was it less perishable than other marketable goods, but salt was also the most important agent of food preservation. As the threat of periodic food shortages loomed large in antiquity, the agent of food preservation was destined to have a monetary role. To people of the antique world, it appeared natural that two vastly different commodities answered their monetary needs, and they took the coexistence of cattle money and salt money for granted. Our linguistic heritage clearly reflects this fact. The English adjective pecuniary and noun salary were derived from the Latin words pecus, cattle, and sal, salt. Even though gold and silver, which later replaced cattle and salt, were far more similar to one another, the dual nature of money persisted throughout the ages. Only towards the end of the 19th century did advances in metallurgy make it possible that one monetary metal, gold, could answer both money needs of man better than any other commodity. This was the development that made it possible to produce or recover gold in molar quantities economically. The practical outcome was the recognition that the best monetary system was gold monometalism. As Bruno Moll put it in his book La Modena, gold is that form of possession which is of the highest elevation above time and space. The dualism of monetary systems is the central theme of this essay, as we explore the two sources of man's need for money. The first, man's need to transfer value over space, was used by Carl Menger to build his theory of value on it. The second, man's need to transfer value over time, or as we shall more specifically describe it, man's need to convert income into wealth and wealth into income, is used here to build a new theory of interest on it. The Janus face of marketability. In developing his theory of value, Menger described the origin of money in terms of the evolution marketability. But as the ancient Italian god Janus, in whose honor the first month of the year is named, marketability has two faces. The first is marketability in the small, or hoardability. The second is marketability in the large, or saleability. The latter is synonymous with Menger's term Absatzfähigkeit, the cornerstone of his theory of value. Hoardability has not been independently analyzed before. In isolating this concept, I propose to lay a new cornerstone for the theory of interest. A commodity is more marketable in the large, or more saleable than another, if the bid-ask spread increases more slowly for the former than for the latter, as each is brought to the market in ever larger quantities. For example, perishable or seasonal goods show the lowest perishable or seasonal goods show the lowest. Durable goods, or goods for all seasons, show the highest degree of saleability. It is easy to see how cattle became the most saleable commodity in antiquity. People had superb confidence that there could never develop a situation in which there was a disturbing surplus of cattle. Long before anything like that could happen, owners would drive their herds to regions where there was a shortage of cattle. The cost of transporting the unit of value represented by cattle over great distances was lower than that of transporting the same value represented by anything else, due to the self-mobility of cattle. This fact, too, is preserved in our linguistic heritage. A herd is also known as a drove of cattle, and a herdsman as a drover. Both are derived from the verb to drive. Thus, mobility, or better still, portability, is an important aspect of saleability. The more portable a commodity is, the more easily it can seek out havens where it is in greater demand. The term saleability refers to the quantity of a good which allows very large quantities of it to be sold during the shortest period of time with minimal losses, which explains how the term earns its name. Among the most saleable goods, we find the precious stones and metals. A long historical process promoted gold to become the most saleable of all goods. For gold, the spread between the ask and the bid prices is virtually independent of the quantity for which it is quoted. It only depends on the cost of shipping gold to the nearest gold center. Under the gold standard, the spread is constant and is equal to the difference between the gold points. By contrast, for all other goods, different spreads are quoted for different quantities, and the larger the quantity, the wider the spread. Thus, the gold standard is seen as the product of a market process in search for the most saleable commodity. Some authors deliberately confuse the issue, insisting that the constant spread of gold is due to institutional factors, i.e., the statutory requirement that the central bank should stand ready to buy at the lower and to sell at the upper gold point in unlimited quantities of gold. Once again, this is a confusion of cause and effect. In reality, institutional constraints would sooner or later break down, and the commodity with less than the perfect saleability would be demonetized by the market. If the authorities tried to promote it to be the monetary standard, as indeed happened to silver in the 19th century, to copper in medieval times, and to iron in antiquity. It is common knowledge that, although they have a high degree of marketability in the large, precious stones have poor marketability in the small. The process of cutting up a large stone into a number of smaller pieces often results in a permanent loss of value. This is just another illustration of the paradox that the value of a parcel is not necessarily the same as the sum total of the values forming part of that parcel. Even for precious metals, whose subdivision into smaller parts is fully reversible, marketability in the small cannot be taken for granted. A penetrating example due to a 19th century traveler is cited by Manger in the Grundsatz. When a person goes to the market in Burma, he must take along a piece of silver, a hammer, a chisel, a balance, and the necessary weights. "How much are those pots?" he asks. "Show me your money," answers the merchant, and after inspecting it, he quotes a price at this or that weight. The buyer then asks the merchant for a small anvil and bellabores his piece of silver with his hammer until he thinks he has found the correct weight. Then he weighs it on his own balance, since that of the merchant is not to be trusted, and adds or takes away silver until the weight is right. Of course, a good deal of silver is lost in the process as chips fall to the ground. Therefore, the buyer prefers not to buy the exact quantity he desires, but one equivalent to the piece of silver he has just broken off. A commodity is more marketable in the small, or more hoardable than another, if the bid-ask spread increases more slowly for the former than for the latter, as each is brought to the market in ever smaller quantity. The term hoardability refers to the quality of goods which allows large stores to be built up piecemeal through hoarding, or to be drawn down through dishoarding, with minimal exchange losses. It is this property that matters most when individuals are trying to convert income into wealth or wealth into income. They succeed best if they employ the most hoardable commodity. It is easy to see how salt became the most hoardable commodity in antiquity. People were confident that exorbitant surpluses of hoardable foodstuff would never develop. Everybody who could afford it would hoard it. People would recall the biblical teaching that the 7 fat years would always be followed by 7 lean ones. For the stronger reason, people were supremely confident that their hoards of salt, this foremost agent of food preservation, would not lose its value, whatever the fortune may hold in store. In antiquity, it was not possible to transfer value over time with smaller losses than those involved in hoarding salt. Other examples of commodities that have been highly hoardable at one time or another throughout history are grains, tobacco, sugar, spirits. It is interesting to note that there has been heavy government involvement in the production and trade of all these. Thus we see that a historical process similar to the one making gold most saleable has promoted silver to become most hoardable. Gold was the money used for paying princely ransoms and for buying territories such as Louisiana and Alaska. And silver was the money used by people of small means for accumulating capital, or Mondi money. Why bimetallism failed. As long as the necessary technology was lacking, gold could not challenge silver's position as the most hoardable commodity. The cost of producing or receiving a small fraction of the unit of value represented by gold could involve expensive molar processes. The recovery of the same small fraction of the unit of value represented by silver incurred no such extra cost, as the amounts involved were not molar, thanks to the lower specific value of silver. However, by the second half of the 19th century, with the progress of metallurgy, the cost of molar processes was lowered, and commercial dealings in gold on the molar scale became economically feasible. Thereafter, gold could effectively challenge and ultimately displace silver as the most hoardable commodity. The demonetization of silver by the market was a logical consequence. To see clearly why it was gold and not silver that was destined to win the race for hegemony, we have to consider the specific values of the monetary metals and their relation to the spreads between the export and import points. Gold has a high and silver a low specific value, implying that the unit of value as represented by gold is lighter than the same as represented by silver. In fact, 15 times lighter if we assume that the gold-silver ratio is 15. We have seen that the gold export-import point is the melted value of the standard coin below which it becomes profitable to export-import gold. The meaning of the export-import points depends on the cost of the shipping unit of value as represented by gold to the nearest gold center abroad. The same is true, mutatis mutandis, for the spread between the silver export-import points. But shipping costs depend on the weight of the shipment. As the weight of the unit of value, as represented by gold, is relatively small, the spread between the gold export-import points will be relatively small. It was approximately 1% of value between New York and London in the heyday of bimetallism, while the spread between the silver export-import points was 15% of value. For example, assume that the statutory gold price is $20 per troy ounce, and the upper and lower gold points are at $20.20 and $19.80 respectively. Assuming further that the official bimetallic ratio is 15, the statutory silver price would be approximately $1.33 per troy ounce, 20 divided by 15. Let us calculate the gold and the silver export-import spreads. The cost of shipping the unit of value, $1, as represented by gold, is 1 cent, because the cost of shipping 1 ounce of gold is $20, minus $19.80 equals 20 cents. This we have to divide by 20, as a standard gold dollar weighs 1/20th of 1 ounce. The melted value of the standard gold dollar may therefore fluctuate between 99 cents and $1.01 before it will induce a corrective movement of gold. The gold export-import spread is 2 cents, but the same unit of value, $1, as represented by silver, is 15 times heavier. So the cost of its shipping will be 15 cents, or 15 times the cost of shipping the standard gold dollar. The melted value of the standard silver dollar may therefore fluctuate between 85 cents and $1.15 before it will induce a corrective movement of silver. It follows that the silver export-import spread is 30 cents, or 15 times wider than the gold spread. we see that under bimetallism, the export-import spread for the monetary metal of the higher specific value is narrower by a factor equal to the bimetallic ratio. It is certainly true that under a monometallic monetary regime, most large transactions will not involve shipment of the metal as long as the price of gold today stays within the range between the gold points. Clearing is effected through the exchange of warehouse receipts. However, the case under bimetallism is different. Here, the arbitrageur profits by actually shipping the undervalued metal out of and the overvalued metal into the country, maintaining a rigid bimetallic ratio. What this shows is that silver is inferior to gold as a standard of value. Those who park their wealth in silver stand to lose 15 times more than those who use gold for the purpose, due to variations in the market ratio between the silver and gold prices. The upshot is that people will gradually move out of silver and into gold. In due course, the market will demonetize the metal with the lower specific value, in this case silver. Gold monometallism was no accident. It was brought about by inexorable market forces. For the first time ever in human history, one commodity, gold, became the undisputed monetary metal, combining the characteristics of the most saleable and the most hoardable assets.